everyone. Welcome to another edition of Mr. Russ in the Virtual School. Today we're going to talk about George Orwell's 1984. So we're really going to talk about three people here. We're talking about George Orwell, who wrote 1984. 1984 was published in 1949, so remember that date. The second guy that we're going to talk about is an English philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham did his writing and thinking in 1785, so well before either 1984 was published or was even thought about. The other guy we're going to talk about is a philosopher named Michel Foucault, who did his writing in 1975. Lots of fives here. And Michel Foucault wrote a book called Discipline and Punish, in which he talks about Jeremy Bentham's ideas. So let's start by addressing Bentham's idea. We've already talked about it significantly in class a few times this year, and Jeremy Bentham is the guy who came up with the panopticon. The panopticon is that perfect prison, that center tower with the open cells around it that the prison guards can see into any tower at any time that they want, and the guards are never sure if they're actually being viewed. So one of the things that the panopticon is a key feature of Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault, and he has a line in here. It says, "In view of this, Bentham laid down the principle that power should be visible and unverifiable. Visible, the inmate will constantly have before his eyes the tall outline of the central tower from which he is spied upon. Unverifiable, the inmate must never know whether he is being looked at any one moment, but he must be sure that he may always be so." Sounds an awful lot like Oceana in 1984. Telescreens. Thought police. And this guy. Foucault writes about how, in order for the system to take place, the panopticon system, there must be at least three processes at work. One, that there must be a functional inversion of the disciplines, which essentially what he writes is that the disciplines, or the social structure of a society, function increasingly as techniques for making individuals useful, which is what we see in 1984 by having people so tied to their jobs. Think about the section in Book 2, Chapter 9, just after Hate Week started, and the enemy is changed from Eurasia to East Asia, so everyone in Winston's department has to work a hellish overtime to correct the record. From the book, Winston was gelatinous with fatigue. He has no time to himself. His energies are completely spent in service to his country. He had worked more than 90 hours in 5 days, so had everyone else at the ministry. It's not just him, it's everybody. So this is a system that is in place across the entirety of Oceania that takes over everyone's lives just after Hate Week and at the drop of a hat. Remember that change happens instantaneously on the next page during a guy's speech. I'm on page 160. The second thing that Foucault talks about having happen is that there has to be a swarming of disciplinary mechanisms. That means that all the things that produce discipline have to be working together towards a single goal. And the single goal of Oceana is complete and utter control of thought, past, present, and future. Think about all the stuff that O'Brien tells Winston in Book 3. Also, in what Foucault says is, sometimes the closed apparatus add to their internal and specific function a role of external surveillance. Thus, and this is the part that's applicable to you, the school must not simply train docile children. It must also make it possible to supervise their parents, to gain information as to their way of life, their resources, their piety, their morals. Think about how insidious the Parsons children are, especially when Parsons winds up in Winston's cell in Book 3. Winston asks him, "Who denounced you?" And Parsons says, "It was my little daughter," said Parsons with a sort of doleful pride. "She listened at the keyhole, heard what I was saying, and nipped off to the patrols the very next day. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh? I don't bear her any grudge for it. In fact, I'm proud of her. It shows I brought her up in the right spirit anyway. He's proud of his daughter turning him in to the police for simply saying something. That's everybody working together in order to control the population. What do you think is going to happen to Parsons' children when they grow up and they have children of their own? It will be the same cycle, constantly repeating over and over again. That panopticon, once it's in place, is impossible to get out of. The third thing that Foucault talks about is that the state will have control of the mechanisms of discipline. In effect, this is Foucault, in effect, in taking over a number of pre-existing functions, the search for criminals, urban surveillance, economic and political supervision, the police magistrates are transposed into a single, strict administrative machine. The thought police. Winston says, right back in the beginning of the book, on page 6, he says, the thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. Remember that way back in the beginning? This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there was no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston has set himself up for failure at the start of this novel. Later on in the same chapter, towards the end of it, he says, whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him just the same. He had committed, would still have committed, even if he'd never set pen to paper, the essential crime that contained all others in itself. Thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later, they were bound to get you. This is that state control of the mechanisms of discipline. There is no escape from this. You have no place to hide. You're constantly watched. You have no privacy. Even your thoughts are controlled. That's the ultimate goal of the party, to control that small space between your ears. None of the end of the book should really shock you, because Winston told us, the part I just read is from page 6. He tells us at the beginning of this book that he's gonna get caught, and there's no way around it for this poor guy. He knows that as soon as he sets his pen to his page, that all bets are off, and it's over for him. He has already damned himself right from the outset. This is the society that he lives in, where even an act as simple as writing means his demise. I really wanted crackling fire for that sound transition, but I couldn't find it. It'll make more sense in a minute. At the end of Book 3, Chapter 1, Orwell writes, speaking through Winston, that of pain you could wish only one thing, that it would stop. Nothing in the world was so bad as physical pain. In the face of pain, there are no heroes. No heroes, he thought over and over as he writhed on the floor, clutching uselessly at his disabled left arm. Winston just got smashed in the elbow by a rubber truncheon repeatedly. I'm going to tell you a story. Let me tell you about Gaius Musius Cordus, better known as Scaevola. This is ancient Rome in 500 BC. If you notice, there aren't really the monuments that you're used to seeing there. In 508 BC, Rome is under siege. Musius Scaevola sneaks into the enemy camp with the intent of killing the enemy leader, thus hoping to lift the siege and save Rome. He fails, is captured, and is brought before the enemy leader to face punishment. Musius Scaevola says, I am Gaius Musius, a citizen of Rome. I come here as an enemy to kill my enemy, and I am as ready to die as I am to kill. We Romans act bravely, and when adversity strikes, we suffer bravely. Watch. And he locks eyes with the enemy leader and thrusts his right hand into the fire until it burns off, never breaking eye contact and showing no sign of pain. The enemy leader is so struck by this, he packs up camp and leaves. So what does this have to do with 1984? Winston says, "In the face of pain, there are no heroes." Sibylla may not have been real. Most likely, it's a story invented to explain that family's last name. Like we've talked about multiple times throughout our reading of 1984, this is a novel about discipline, control, and punishment. At the end, we see that George Orwell has crafted a very realized world, not much different than our own. And that's a scary thing, considering that this book was written in 1948.